Thank you very much for the introduction. I would normally give a host of comments thanking everybody for having me with you and the privilege to talk to you, but I've been given so little time to talk, I'm dispensing with it all, and I'm talking immediately. So, a title, here's your beloved city of Washington, D.C., which I will not talk about hardly at all, because there are others who know it better. But while it's on the screen, I will read you a comment from a nationally, if not globally, famous urban designer, Ray Gindros from UDA in Pittsburgh, who wrote back when I asked him a similar question to the ones we'll address tonight. My initial thoughts on the subject are based on the very old-fashioned phrase, common ground. In the common ground, anything goes. But how is it defined? Example, during the Occupy London movement, the settlers camped in the spaces in front of and next to St. Paul's Cathedral. No one seemed to mind too much because the paths to the cathedral's entrances were kept clear. Those spaces are adjacent to the main thoroughfare, so they're very public. Paternoster Square, a privately owned series of public spaces, were closed off, and the Occupy group was not allowed in. Ironically, it turned out to be bad for business. In the design of public space, it is critical to define the paths through the space. These are open to everyone. There are usually areas of influence within the space that are identified with individual uses. Appropriate definition is needed for these, and then the common ground that is shared by these uses and by the general public is the main focus of the space. So I take that as a preamble to now the quickest slideshow you're likely ever to see. Tighten your seatbelts. I may, if I have time, return to a discussion about a book that has 40 essays on this subject, which really are the result of Occupy Wall Street. Some of the people who are writing I may quote. But I wanted to start with a question about what made us look at open space and how important it is today. And it seemed to me that in November last, in New York and in LA and in other places around the country, there was an Occupy movement, and that Occupy movement took place on a lot of different kinds of spaces in a lot of different kinds of cities. This last one in New Haven, by the way, the longest to be occupied, the latest to be left after a quite friendly court case, as I have heard, that determined the Village Green was not appropriate for long-term residency. The other issue that happened, which I think precedes the Occupy movement, we also know, and we know it too well, was what happened in 9/11. You yourselves here celebrated, or I memorialized or discussed this in a Freedom Without Fortresses program shortly after 9/11. So these two issues to me are married and entwined. One, the product of terrorism that produced a somewhat state of paranoia and fear, and the other one, a social movement which has to deal with the consequences of that initial event. The consequences of that initial event in New York being an initial blockage to Wall Street and the stock exchange, which then eventually the wonderful firm of Rogers Marvel does a magnificent job, I must say, in populating the street furniture in and around New York with devices that work quite well, but you never miss them for what they are. And then you have the more powerful ones that you see here in Washington everywhere that let you know that you're living in territory that is under threat. And this continues. Again, I don't know if I have to tell you about that. For those of you who have not had the opportunity yet to visit New York and the memorial at 9/11, this too is carefully guarded. It's more difficult to get onto this site at the moment than it is to get into an airport. And yet it is, in fact, supposed to be one of the nation's most public memorial meditative reflective spaces. By the time you get there, you really wonder. The designer of it and I have spoken often. There are questions about how it's been resolved that if we have time for, we can discuss later. But let's look back into the nature of who we are and how we get to be where we are. I always like to think back to the beginning, if I can, of what sets our state of mind towards the space we occupy. And let's face it, we're a Judeo-Christian culture, and basically we are told the city is bad and the country is good. You have to leave the country because you've been bad. You can't go to the city because you are bad. So this sort of seeds the territory of how we make what it is we live in. 9,400 years ago, Catalhayek in the Anatolian Plateau, beautiful example of a kind of a proto-urban setting. This is how it is. Narrow streets, open spaces. That's what it looked like almost 10,000 years ago. This is what it looked like in Nigeria not that long ago. Narrow streets, open spaces. This is how it looks like in North Africa today, in Morocco, a Qasar with narrow spaces and open places. And of course, we have the classics that we're all familiar with, the Agora, the Forum. One of the beautiful pieces in that book is a discussion of the sloppiness and the filthiness of the Agora by philosopher Marshall Berman. I hope you get to read that. And from Paul Zucker, just the beginnings of what it is that we look at when we think of open space, the simple level of what happens, a few social activities, some movement, some exchange, before it gets overlaid with the other layers of civilization. But even here, 1700s, Book of Days, and the most ideal, as we know, the most ideal place, except for one other, Siena, the city of good government. Hopefully some of you are familiar with this, but a clear division between inside and outside, and you can see the activities, the intellectual and social and commercial exchanges of humanity happening in the painting in City Hall, and of course in the central Campo itself, famous for not only the festivities, but the size, the shape, the form, the color, the materials. And again, you can find this in all of the Bastides of southwest France. You can find it repeated in Paris in Place Royale, or now Place de Vosges. Here it is from Google. And my favorite, the small town of Pienza in Tuscany, which for any of you who have traveled to Italy, you know that if you're involved in this business at all, design, urban design, you will be yanked by the arm and taken to Pienza so you can witness what will produce, at least in my experience, tears of joy and wonder at experiencing something that is so well designed. And this is a tradition that exists in Europe. I don't know that it survives here, but it survives in the work that I do and in the work of my peers. So, I should go back to that. Let's see. This is a series of drawings, extracted 2 drawings from a set of 15 that Ray Gindros, the man I quoted, did of his arrival, his time spent, and his departure in Pienza, and he shared them, and they'll be in the book. But they're so beautiful, and it's just that sensibility that obviously he gets. And then again, here's his Canaletto, Canale, in Venice, a city made up of 6 districts. Each one of them has a major square with a well and places for people to gather. And it's at this point I probably should say that I tend to think as we go through these spaces that they're all paved spaces. It seems to me that there's a big difference that we may get to discuss between parks and plazas, and I think the inference here was we might discuss parks, but I think I'd like to discuss plazas because I think they don't get so muddy. And you can congregate and occupy and demonstrate and so on. Reality moving, obviously, from all of the images I showed to today, and this is something we could discuss. I easily see it from my childhood. I grew up in a country that was 143 million people, and half of them lived on the farm. And now it's a country of more than twice that number, and 80% of them live in the city. And I know it, because the cities are crowded, and they're comfortably crowded. But the fact is, it's a reality that has to contend with, because when I grew up, the streets were fairly empty. Here's New York. This is the old world, new world, before the new world turns into what we know is the master control system of the rational, civilized world, the almighty grid. Here it is in Savannah. Here it is in Washington, D.C., overlaid. Here it is, of course, in New York, where Lisa Keller, in her wonderful history, says, when the grid was laid out in New York, there was not even one open space. There was no public space. There was a group of citizens who got together and lobbied, and 5 spaces were added, Union Square, Madison Square, and so on, because every square inch had to be rateable. Tax had to be made on every square inch. There was no space for people to just gather and not produce income. So we have that as part of the New York legacy. And of course, this is the rest of the country with a great grid that goes over the West that Jefferson laid out. And I just sort of like it because it shows the disappearance of the natural virgin forest, of which we have none. And here a small town in Wisconsin that shows how it was once completely vegetated and now it's completely open. So that business of the Garden of Eden and where it is and what nature of open space we like like to enjoy is up for question. The Europeans whacked us good with Corb's notion that I didn't make this up. This is not I didn't produce this on my computer. This is out of his book, Death to the Streets. There was a move in Europe post-war, or post-First World War, to reform their overly crowded and tight medieval cities. And so they had to get rid of streets. We didn't, but they did. But the idea of street life became terribly questioned, and then that was added to. It was totally dramatized by the advent of the automobile, which according to Camillo Sitte, who didn't even live that long into the auto era, said it would be the death of urban space, that the contest between the automobile and humanity would be the ruination of public space. And we certainly have seen that to a large extent. I noticed it outside the building earlier. Here, I noticed a parking lot. I couldn't believe there was a parking lot next to this building. Here, the occupation of streets by different kinds of the same number of people standing to walk, sitting in cars, or on bicycles. And so you can see, once people get their hands on cars, public space becomes owned by cars. And cities become owned by highways and parking lots and so on. This is part of the mix. I think if we were in the suburbs, we'd say that's great because you can hold a summer fair on the parking lot of the closed supermarket. But in the city, it's not a good idea. And then we have the other great proposals, the Mises, the Hilbersheimers, and the rest, where they separate people from traffic. And look at it, it's just horribly deadly. But you know, when I was in school, it was something to be looked at carefully. The cars had the ground plane, people were up there, everything was separated, no place to gather necessarily. And while Corb produced this for Paris in New York, we actually built it on the Lower East Side. We took down a whole section of the city. They wouldn't dream of doing it in Paris. And we replaced it with something that's not all bad. Nothing is ever all bad. But it certainly did away with the street life. This is a comparison of open space around the country. On the top, I believe, is Albuquerque with too much to even comprehend. At the bottom is Chicago, and above it, New York. And somewhere in the middle is Washington, D.C. You folks have 3 times the amount of space that we have in New York. And I feel it every time I come here because it's absolutely beautiful and lovely, especially now. But in New York, we suffer from a lack of open space of all kinds, and we have to be seen that way. And it somehow, I think, is related to the Occupy movement, no matter where it takes place, the availability, type, amount, and distribution of space you have. Now, I'm not going to read this, but it is the question that I sent to Ray Gindros and others, and I might take the opportunity later on to read one more quote. Give me like a 20-minute notice. I grew up on the streets of New York. These are images along the top. Old men sit, young girls sit on benches. This is how we socialize. We might not do it so much now in the streets, but there was a time when I was growing up, this is where you played. There wasn't much traffic in 1948 or 51, and you didn't have to worry, and they went slow. And, you know, you jumped around, and you played games. In the summer, it got hot. In lots and things like that, nobody kept you out. You went, you looked for a puddle, you made a boat. I mean, it was very loose. It was very easy. It was very comfortable. It wasn't so regulated. You could skate in Soho, and you could have really strange people. This is a man who I must say I knew in New York. I used to say hello to him. He stood on the corner of 6th Avenue and 53rd Street. His name was Moondog. He has a real name. And he actually became a quite celebrated musician. But he was able to stay there and nobody bothered him. He just was good company and good flavor. Maybe some of that begins to return. This is LA looking at street life. But one of the things I wanted to share coming through that and into the notion that there is a typology of open space that we certainly won't discuss tonight, but it should be kept in mind as we discuss what we do discuss, is this is a study by a group in a book called Public Space, Carr and his colleagues. And it's a list of all the types of open spaces. So parks and downtown parks and commons and neighborhood and small ones, central squares, pocket parks. I won't go through the definition of park and plaza, but markets, and then all of the streets and the playgrounds and the schoolyards. There's a vast amount of information that goes into what I think otherwise when we read about it or see it looks fairly simple and one-dimensional, but it's very multidimensional. And the people who design in this arena actually do think through all of these things, even though they don't ever seem to get it exactly right. And I'll get to why I think they don't. Sorry about that. And then there's the AIA, Livable Communities Studies. It's interesting that on the list of problems, traffic congestion, on the list of desires, on the other side is basically assembly and parks and open space. In other words, congestion and parks and open space do have some relationship at the top of lists. In terms of that typology, big parks. There's a big park just built next to Venice to give it some breathing space, some lungs, adapted industrial space. This is Manhattan, which is currently getting what's called the Emerald Necklace, developed around the whole perimeter to replace its industrial edge. Paris, as we know, all the way from the Louvre over to up in the corner of the Bois de Boulogne, Central Park with its great vast spaces occupied. There's a park in Paris also occupied. And the Luxembourg Gardens, the kind of don't walk on the grass park. The Zocalo in Mexico City, usable for many, many different things by many different people at many different times. And even the Boston City Hall Plaza, which is known to be the greatest failure in urban design ever. But you know, when you fill it up with a lot of people, as they did in '07, it looks pretty good. So maybe it's not quite as bad as everyone thinks. Maybe it's a management, maybe it's a discretionary problem. We'll discuss that. This Federation Square, a new square in totally cultural square in Australia. These, again, two kind of favorites. The top, the Pompidou Center with a circle of people doing some artwork on the top. One of the most successful plazas in the Marais. It was looked upon as a potential disaster. I think it's a total magnet for the city. But at the bottom, what I consider to be its predecessor, the Gemma El Fna in Marrakesh, which is a market, like as shown on the right, that changes markets 3 times a day, 7 days a week. It has 21 activities a week that happen in it. And if you sit in a cafe and watch it, well, it's the best show in the world. This one, a smaller square, as a case study in a way, the George Orwell Plaza in the old Gothic quarter of Barcelona. Some of you may know it. Some know it as a drug den. Other people know it as a neighborhood park. Other people know it as a meeting point. It's all of those things. And there's a nice piece in the book that's coming out by Michael Piatuk about how neighborhood parks function and how they can function for many reasons. This one in Lisbon, Camaro Park Square, which on the left is paved and on the right is turfed. In the spring, they cover it with turf so people can go and lay on the grass. And then when it gets too hot and the turf dies, they uncover it and it returns to a congregate plaza. So, you know, there's a lot of ways to cut this. This, of course, in Amsterdam on a canal, but this up the way in Leiden when it freezes and people just go right off that deck and set that cafe right up on that ice. Because I tell you, this is insurgent public space. People will gather any place they can. This is dancing in Barcelona. It goes on every Sunday outside the cathedral. And here in Asia, another group dancing. Here in Pershing Square, heading in another direction, a direction that we all know, which is the direction of the other. There is, in all of the literature about the Occupy movement, a direct and legal connection to homelessness in America. These are connected economically, they're connected socially, they're connected urbanistically, and they are recognized sometimes more hermetic than they should be for the people's own rights. And sometimes we actually don't know exactly what's going on. If you were in India, why there are people sleeping all over the place, just taking a break from their daily work. They're not considered homeless. They're not considered vagrants. So this is on the Upper West Side, New York, across from Lincoln Center. This is Federal Plaza downtown in New York. Used to be a terrible space. It was a terrible space until Holly White, William H. White, did a study, a scientific study that resulted in a book called The Social Life of Small Urban Spaces. And he analyzed what makes them work and what doesn't. And he found basically one, put a little food and social and deadly spaces often come to life quite nicely. And this has now happened all throughout New York and I think the rest of the country. But there were a whole other things to do with sun and paving and accommodation and seating. This is the Ramblas in Barcelona, one of the great streets that evidences some of those same things. This is an extraordinary project by John Jerde in Rotterdam. Celebrated by Jan Gale, who I believe spoke here and may even have spoken about it. But this is a city that had a roadway sliced through it that separated the city, as we did to many of ours in the 50s, and divided the commercial district, and they got sort of fed up with it. It's very hard to do an overpass. It's very hard to do an underpass. But they have done absolutely the most successful underpass under a major roadway that I've ever seen. I saw this as a visitor to Rotterdam, had no idea it was something so carefully calibrated, and when I saw it published, did a little research. It's a fabulous thing. Celebration in Miami, celebration in Okinawa, celebration in Broadway of the opening of a Busby Berkeley show on 42nd Street. And finally, I think coming to the end of this sequence, in New York City, recognizing that it's our streets that rule, fortunately, our good mayor and his commissioner, Sadiq Khan, have begun to grab back acres of roadway that is unused by anything and make it into public gathering spaces. And this is at Madison Square, but when I tell you, this is in Jackson Heights, in a suburb done in what she is very proud of real time. She says, just drop some granite at the end of the block and you have a functioning plaza on Main Street. But this Times Square, which some of you may recall was closed about 3 years ago, to the dismay of many, all said it would fail. And by the next time you visit New York, it will now be a permanently hard paved space, I think designed by Snowhetta, because it's been totally successful. No problem, no contest. So what about this part? What about the public assembly? What about the disobedience, the protests? This is the locations of all the Occupy movements by, I think, December. It's when we put together a program in New York that I will not go through in any detail. I put this in because Scott told me to. This is the bonus army being removed from the banks of the Anacostia. And this, of course, you might even get this, that's me. Protesting the demolition of Penn Station in 1963. So I go back a ways and trying to get out there and use that public space. That's Jane Jacobs and Philip Johnson and the rest, even if you lose, you get a nice picture out of it. And this is, hometown, 1963. This is Prague, or maybe Moscow, and current photographs of Hyde Park recently, the French election, and another series of crowds crossing the river in Moscow, which I thought was important to get that flow. After the war, in Public Square in Berlin, protesting the threat of communism filling up the plaza. Albert Shanker, famous educator in New York, protesting decentralization of the school system in front of New York City's City Hall. I don't think I have a photograph of City Hall today, but you cannot go and protest at City Hall today. City Hall in New York has been blocked off. From time immemorial, or the beginning of New York, you went to City Hall to protest. 9/11 happens, it's been closed, as have a number of things with the erosion of the potential of gathering based on I'm not sure what yet. I don't want to be taken as a naive who doesn't understand threat. I do. But I also question some of these moves here at Union Square. And this, a wonderful, wonderful small meeting space designed by Paul Friedberg in a public housing project, the Jacob Riis houses on the Lower East Side. And if I could, no, I won't. During the panel, perhaps I'll read you Paul Friedberg's feelings about the design of public space, which he does extremely well. I mean, the bottom of it is drop the ego, deal with the space and the people's activities. This is a protest in Copenhagen against cars usurping bike space, something against Jerry Falwell. I'm showing this just to seed the discussion for later. It's not as if all of these are separated out for one reason or another. It's like setting the table of what is this public space we're discussing. Here, Mothers Against the War, these people were driven out by police on horseback. And of course, then we come to the moves of today in Tahrir Square, the violence that can result, the resulting tit-for-tat protests and joinery in the Puerta del Sol in Madrid, and going back to the simple notion that even Jane Jacobs knew in 1960 when she wrote that cities have the capability of providing something when they are created by everybody. So this participatory aspect of which this is only a piece. This is a piece of that participatory aspect. This is a question to us in a way. Because if you can't do this here, where can you do it? And that's part of the problem, because during the course of this next series of slides, you'll see the folks from Zuccotti Park moved out and move along the streets and go over to Foley Square, which is in the center of the Court District in Lower Manhattan, to regather there some weeks later because they weren't allowed in the Zuccotti privately owned public space, so they went to the publicly owned public space. And they didn't stay there long either, of course. But this was a space that was actually prepared by the city to receive demonstrations. There's places for news trucks to plug in. But there is an issue with that. And the issue with that, well, again, it's another quote, but basically the issue with that is that people don't necessarily want to go to places that have been prepared for them to do something the way somebody else wants them to do it. That's almost the reason they don't do it. So this was a fallback position from Zuccotti. And this one, of course, for those who may know, this square in Houston is extraordinary. Donated as it was a original land owned by Mr. Herman, an industrialist, who donated the park to the city, but with a covenant that people were allowed to sleep in it, because when he owned it, he had workers, and when they got drunk, he didn't like to pay for them to go to hotels, so he said they could sleep on his property, and that survives to today. So police don't move people out of Herman Square. And they had such a nice thing that there was a dual debate between who was going to have a demonstration or something. And one group that was there, well, we'll leave for 2 days. You do your thing. We'll come back. They're very nice. It's very strange. Philadelphia, this is the 2 images that were sent by Laurie Owen. Laurie Owen said, I designed this according to government requests for a paved area for 200 people to demonstrate. And look what happened. The minute they came to demonstrate, they walked all over the grass. So, Boston, pardon? 5 minutes? I think we got it. And finally, the idea of privately owned public space, the greatest oxymoron that I've ever heard, privately owned public space, which I also realize is an acronym for publicly owned public space and privately owned private space. So you can take it as you will, but since it is the generator, in a way, of what we had in New York, the privately owned public space is basically 500 of them around New York. They're grand, they're great, many of them are great, although a number of them are disastrous failures. Up and down 6th Avenue, pits in the ground nobody would dream of going into that result in billions of dollars worth of additional income from the stuff. So they're not a simple, it's not a simple thing. Gerald Caden's book on privately owned public space is a superb book. This is a 1 acre park elevated above the street, done by Rogers Marvel, again, who are doing the lawn by the White House. And it's superb. There's absolutely nothing wrong with it. So these are sometimes the best things that you can get. They're better than apple pie. Zuccotti Park started off as a park designed by SOM that did the building next to it. This is a shot of it with an installation by the artist Ken Smith. It was sort of perfectly fine, but after 9/11, I think everybody wanted a change of scenery. It was redesigned by Cooper Robertson. Alex Cooper's got a piece in this book as well. He discusses exactly what they did and exactly how well they did it. And he's just amazed that a park that he designed, he knows in his heart, to be a beautifully small, intimate park has become a world-famous public place. So there's a part of this which is you never know. There have been, over the last decade or so, an enormous number of books written on this subject. I think these books have been written because we're approaching a point where public space is somewhat critical in the landscape or domain of American culture. And I think people are looking at it. I don't have half of those titles, of course, listed here, and there are many that preceded it, but without the same urgency. So we may get to that. We have a woman in New York, Paula Siegel, who goes around to the privately owned public spaces, like the one on the top, to find many of them blocked. This is something, again, if you've been reading the papers, Chase Manhattan Bank blocked it. Why? They wouldn't say. The police had to be called. It went to the courts. They took it down. They just felt like it. They don't want trouble. I went by the other day Rockefeller Center, a privately owned private space that I have taken every visitor I've ever taken to New York to at any time of the day. And on the website, 2 weeks ago, it said it was open 24 hours a day. And on the website today, it says it's open from 9 to midnight, and it's been closed. And it's a place of wonder. Well, I don't know what that is. It's a place of wonder that somehow has been taken from public access, a philanthropic place, which is more important. And of course, this is kind of bringing it back home. I'm not going to tell you about your own town. That we can discuss further in the discussions with the panel. But there is the reminder that, of course, it's a right that we're given to assemble. The discussion is how, who manages it, who decides. This is an ongoing discussion and debate. It will never be answered, by the way. I don't think this does. This is an ethical question that lives and survives in dialogue, and that's the only way it moves ahead. With that, I hope that you can all get a look at this book one of these days, and as I promised, I'm going to leave a map of Washington as a legacy for us to discuss. Thank you.
Okay, that was a whirlwind tour through the history of public space, going from the Agora in Athens to Occupy, and that's a pretty great survey. But what struck me in your presentation, and maybe we'll just start off with this, is kind of brackets or parentheses, which really, one parenthesis is 9/11, 2001, and the other parenthesis is Occupy, literally 10 years later in 2011. And those two, that's really a lens between those through which we're now looking at public space. So it includes the pressure to demonstrate, to use, to be open, but also obviously the pushback to be secure. And I can't help but notice how clear that came through in your presentation. So actually, with that maybe as our opening lens, I'm going to go to Tom at the end of the row here and bring it back to Washington a bit, because those two issues are certainly in sharp relief here in Washington. But from your perspective with the Commission of Fine Arts, maybe we'll just open with a really naive question that I think Lance sort of raised a bit, which is, what is public space for? What's it for, and what's it for really in a city like Washington? Is it an expression of an ideal? Is it just convenient air between buildings? What does it do for the city? What does the plan of Washington show?
Well, I don't know. Can you hear me? I guess it's a huge question, but I'm happy to tackle it a little bit. I think you have to remember in Washington, at least as it's come to play out, is that we have a kind of a dichotomy of, I think maybe an interesting way to describe it would be sacred versus secular space. Mm-hmm. And this is, I think, the aspirations of the city in its physical form always had a political agenda, an idealistic agenda, coming out of political philosophy, and I think there's a sense of idealism about literally trying to create the best government, manifest literally in the form of the city. So that's the underlying bones. Clearly the L'Enfant plan radiates that literally throughout the city. I think to take that forward a century to 100 years ago, to the Macmillan effort, the Senate Park Commission plan, this was coming out of a progressive era idea. We had to, again, work on two levels. For the normal city, the citizens, the people, there was an enormous effort to actually bring a comprehensive park system into Washington, which had been somewhat, lacking compared to its other, other cities of its type. However, there was also this extension of the sacred idea of really a more ennobled environment. And, we've been studying this, and the commission just had a centennial a couple years ago. We were doing this very ambitious history book, and some of the very interesting things come out. One idea which we've discovered is Burnham's own background in Swedenborgianism, which perhaps values this idea of heaven on earth, trying to recreate a heavenly city. And we think that there's probably an interesting connection there between literally bringing that to this city. So that's a long way of saying, it has to work on two levels, and where the 20th century has been so remarkable in taking that frame, I don't know what that, is that me? Taking that frame, that canvas that was created through these centuries of planning and enlivening it through the possibility of people getting here by automobile or whatever mechanism, and to broadcast their message through mass media. I think that's what we really saw in the 20th century.
Well, so now we're broadened to about a century, and I'm going to take this opportunity to sort of identify the other members of the panel, and I'm going to do that by asking Lucy Barber, who's our historian. But after we sort of make those official introductions, I hope that you guys can certainly argue among each other. Ideally, I'll make myself perfectly obsolete, and you can discuss things. So Lucy and then Faye, I'm going to ask you another question, and then we'll start with a general discussion. So Tom sort of laid out the fact that we have these contested spaces, sort of sacred and secular, for lack of a better word. And over the 20th century, back to the late 19th, that's literally been contested by a lot of pushing back about who uses that space. I wonder if you could give the audience a little bit of a background on some of the things we take for granted in Washington, like being able to walk on the grass at the Capitol.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, I think that's one of the things that I would always caution as a historian who focused on the history of marching on Washington, that one of the things is that things that we just do take for granted today, that a certain kind of march, maybe not Occupy, but many sort of peaceful one-day marches are, acceptable, was not at all the case in 1894 when the first, what I would call, March on Washington happened. I mean, it was literally seen as this is outside the norm of American politics. It's outside the norm of what you're supposed to do in the Capitol. The assumption that the First Amendment gave you a right to assemble was actually a highly contested notion in the courts. I mean, as I loved your words, so I'm not going to remember them right now, Lance, about this is a dialogue that we have to have all the time. But the courts regularly said, to not just in Washington, but in all over the place, no, you have no right to come here or to do that activity. And on the case of the Capitol grounds, there was no right to assemble on the grounds of the Capitol. And the reasons for that are somewhat disputed. I've seen it attributed to disorder associated with the egg rolls. That was my most recent because the egg rolls that now we associate with the White House used to happen at the Capitol building. But I also just think that there were some times when people partied there, got a little disorderly, and so they just said no more speeches, parades, any other type of thing. And so when this group of people came to the Capitol in 1894 and with the intent of asking for a dramatic change in law, and their destination was Congress, they didn't care about the White House, so they went to the Capitol. They were warned they would be arrested if they walked on the Capitol grounds, and two of their leaders did. They were arrested, put in jail, and fined $5 and 20 days in jail, which is, if you think about what actually happens most of the time now, if you violate a law associated with assembly, which people do consciously in many protests, and Occupy D.C. protesters did it at the Supreme Court and other places, you don't tend to get that severe a penalty. So they really took it seriously, and they did everything to try to get it to stay away. And I think, it's one of, as a historian, I really appreciate being reminded of how central public space is, but also in the American context, I think it's really important to also think about how long it took for protests to be as regularized in some ways than in other countries. I mean, you look at London, and they're having marches to the Capitol, far in the 17th century, the 16th century, and it's just our capital was slow to become that central destination.
And yet we take that for granted now.
Yeah.
And we assume that we have those rights and that they go all the way back to the founders, to the First Amendment. And Faye, as a landscape architect, you can introduce yourself a bit. You're working on some projects right now that are sort of in the thick of things. And I think, as Lance talked about earlier, design can't totally determine what's going to happen in a space, but it can make some things more likely to happen and other things less likely to happen. In your practice as a landscape architect, how do you strike a balance with that, particularly in a high-profile project like the Supreme Court project that you're working on?
Well, I'm working on a number of projects at that scale. I want to come back before I get to that, because I think the issue of design is a really critical one. I think very often urban design and the more tactile part of landscape design, landscape architecture, are kind of mushed together, and they really need to be separated. I think one of the issues that Lance pointed out, which I loved since I just got back from vacation in Italy and was blown away by having the opportunity to be in Siena, in Pienza, in Modena, was to see how brilliantly the public spaces work, because they're not designed. What they are is established for basic human function. Every single public square has public restrooms that are maybe not perfectly clean, but accessible. They're 100 meters away from wherever you are. There is retail all the way around the square. It closes at 12:30. People go away. Then they show up again at 4 o'clock or 3:30. So there's a sort of a lull. But there's a basic human function that's accommodated in the urban design and the urban planning that becomes part of daily life. So when I was in Modena, I was mentioning this a little earlier, we arrived and it was Independence Day, so there was a communist march, there was an anti-fascist march, which was held with the communists. I'm not sure how they managed that. Then in the same area, there was a sanctioned public display of respecting their independence and the formation of Italy. And about 4 hours later, when the shops opened again, there was an open-air market selling all kinds of wonderful food and products. So people were able to come and go, and there was an ebb and flow of gathering that made that a really wonderful public space. There was no grass, there were no trees, it was completely comfortable. It was what I would call undesigned and very free. So the opportunity to move around freely and unobstructed, and the opportunity to have basic human services was absolutely there. The other thing that I want to talk about is this sort of ethical issue that I think is part of the longer dialogue, and then I'll stop talking, which has to do with the difference between assembly and gathering and taking up residence. I think we have often experienced assembly and gathering in public spaces, small and large, over the centuries, over thousands of years. The thing that makes the Occupy Wall Street and the Occupy movement a little different is this need to establish residency, that people are camping. And that's something that's a bit different. And if you look at the places in Italy, for example, that already have the restrooms, that have the restaurants, that have the retail, it really could happen as not a big deal, and people could be accommodated and then they could go away. Here it's a lot more different, because when you occupy a public park that has not got that kind of accommodation near it, what do you do for basic human sanitation? And that's a really big design issue. So I've got more to say, but I'll wait.
Dive in, Lance.
Just a point of order. A point of order. The square in Pienza was designed.
Yes.
Not accidental.
No,
Anyway.
I don't think they're not designed. But what I'm talking about is a sort of a moderation of objects and stuff in the space. They're designed deliberately, but they're very open. And I'll talk about that a little more also.
You know, the professor in me is wanting to
Good.
debate this.
Good.
They're designed. There's no doubt they're designed. There was an architect involved, Bernardo Rossellino.
Yes.
He worked, his client was Pope Pius II,
Yes.
who wanted his hometown of Pienza to be perfected, and he came and he did it with a plaza, with arcades, with shops, with a cistern.
Yes.
It's a design place. It
Yes.
has a hard base. As we all know, I think I might not have said earlier, grass is a bad place to protest
Yeah.
or do anything.
Yeah,
I mean, it's just
absolutely.
bad. It gets muddy. So the Europeans
DC
have-
knows this.
a quote from another of the people who I asked if they would render some words of wisdom on this. This is Donlin Linden, very well-known urban designer, publisher of Places magazine, responding to the question of the evening. The public and the private are intensely entwined in the United States. Their intersections are the stuff of politics. The essential issue for designers concerned with the public realm is to recognize that entanglement, to think beyond boundaries, for each design process to begin with the confinements of property, for buildings and spaces to be conceived first, as they usually are, without regard for accountability to a larger setting, is a most destructive thing for our cities. And he's saying, as educators, we have to think differently. So I'm reinforcing what you said, that it's the activities and the actions, the type, the amount, and the distribution that we want to accommodate in the designs that we produce. It's not the designs we produce with the hope that those things will take place, or they're not mutually exclusive. It can certainly happen.
Yeah, and let me go back to one thing, because we did look at Piccolomini's design very carefully and understand that it's highly crafted and highly precise, and that he was obsessive about the details. But I think what I'm getting at is a tendency, and this is responding to a question that was in some of the materials that we were handed, it's a tendency for contemporary designers to want to make a statement about themselves rather than making places for people. And I think Piccolomini did that brilliantly with the whole space in Pienza, and I think the Campo. I mean, all of those piazzas are designed, and very intentionally so, but they are designed in such a way as to be not intrusive. And I think that's really what I was saying, but to allow the normal human functions to happen. So we can discuss that more as well.
Well, actually, let's stay on that a while, because that seems to be a really interesting topic when we're in a space that feels just right, to use a sort of Goldilocks phrase. We can mistake it for not having been designed, right? We can assume that it just came about naturally, when in fact the design is at the root of that. And yet we can be in places that are show the hand of the designer, and yet, for example, might not have bathrooms or cafes or things that we might need to actually really enjoy that space. And so that gets into this really interesting question about, do contemporary urban designers, landscape architects see the task of designing public space differently? And is there a tendency to over-design and relate it to activities and functions? Does this change how we use our public spaces? Or should we just pave them? We're quite fond of grass here in Washington, right? So we've got the anti-grass contingent here. Maybe if we just have some open paved plazas,
So the tourists could
Do you wanna
like
talk about
die sooner on their great trek from monument to monument because the temperature would go up even higher? Sorry.
I think really to answer
Taller
this,
buildings.
Oh, yeah. Okay. More shade.
there's public space and there's public space. I think you have to be careful about, you're not going to design or even conceive of every kind of space as being one that can accommodate, an Occupy movement, for example, or that would be appropriate for demonstration. So I think you have to, in the discussion here, you have to focus on what might be right for a neighborhood square, or even like say DuPont Circle is a lovely place, and it's great for relaxation and snowball fights and chess. It may not be the place where people want to camp. It could be.
Oh, it could have been.
But it is
I'm surprised they didn't go
But they
there.
didn't.
But it's
No,
not.
and I think it was only because the White House was closer. I mean,
you're-
DuPont, I think, would have been fine.
Well, I
I
think-
mean, but I think that
Yeah.
the only, it's, if we had our little map, we would say it's because McPherson Square was so close.
It was close.
Was the closest place to the White House that wasn't under lockdown by security. And the two factions in Occupy needed to be separated. So you had one down on Freedom Plaza and one up at McPherson. During the anti-war movement, they used DuPont Circle for protests all the time. There's nothing inherently
unusable about
it.
I guess
to
my
me.
question is to make the distinction, though, about how are we defining public space? Are we saying that it always has to be a canvas for this kind of thing?
You know, I
No,
have
I don't think so.
a wonderful quote from this book that these people spent all these years writing on public
Yeah.
space. And they give a definition, which we can, push back to. But the term public open space implies the freedom to use a place. But there are numerous constraints that prohibit or discourage members of the public from exercising their rights. We have identified a number of qualities essential to the promotion of these rights. Freedom of access is a basic requirement, and physical, visual, and symbolic barriers can limit the availability of public settings. So we know how to prevent it in places that suggest that they represent it. Freedom of action, the right to use a place, also is necessary, but it calls for a reconciliation amongst competing interests, rules, and regulations. The right includes both freedom from disturbance and interference and freedom to use a place in a desired manner. I won't go on with this, but it's interesting, and that's why I said there's an ethical component to this in the debate about how a particular space is going to be used, and this is certainly at the core or the heart of what happened at Zuccotti Park, because the law said open 24 hours a day, access and action. And somehow or other, in the eventuality of that, it wasn't true. That the people who wanted to have it be the way they wanted to have it be employed powers that they had access to, that the demonstrators did not. Peter Mafcuse, a wonderful writer in New York, a teacher at Columbia University, said if it was the matter of sanitation, which the city used as a reason to clear it so they could hose it down, which wasn't the case, it was pretty well managed, he said, why didn't the city just deliver a few porta potties or whatever else they needed? It's an easy thing to do. That wasn't a good reason. That was using filth as politics. So it's always going to be a debate. And this one, of course, is a big one that will continue to test these issues. I do, because of my designer urban bent, think there are whole issues of green or non-green and all of that. I think it's a good and worthwhile discussion. But I think it's more a matter of who controls it, where the power lies, to do what people want to do in what has already been defined as public. Nobody is going to protest, I wish they did, the closing of Rockefeller Center. It's a privately owned, private space. There's Greenacre Park, Paley Park. In New York City, we have 3 or 4 wonderful philanthropic parks that are totally under the control of those who own them. Nobody's going to say anything if they close them, but if you have a negotiation that says you're going to leave this open 24 hours a day, and for that, we're going to give you 50,000 square feet at the top of your building, you better keep it open.
Well, and I think these POPs, privately owned public space, but as you pointed out, that acronym applies to any variation of private public owned space, are a phenomenon that's much more common in New York City than here. And so I think that those conditions are somewhat unfamiliar here.
I do.
There are some here, privately owned public spaces, but it isn't really part of the language the way it is in New York. Which gets back to this question about Washington and whether there's something unique about the public space in Washington. Because it's the nation's capital, where there was Occupy in Portland, Denver, Atlanta, all over.
I have another quote from Diana Belmore, but it goes to this point. I remember some years ago visiting Washington and marveling, and I still do, I marvel at how beautiful this city is. It's one of the most beautiful cities I've ever been in. The paving in front of the old post office, the care and nurturing of the parks, and the manicuring of the lawns, everything is there. And I remember asking somebody, I guess at the GSA, how is it that it's so beautiful? And they said the whole nation pays for it. And I'm saying this because Diana Balmori, in her response to my question, said, how is it that we put so much resource forward to maintain many of our buildings, maintain many of our monuments, and that many of our public areas go so unattended? And I must say, if you go to a city like Barcelona, they take care of all of those public spaces as well. And she concluded, rhetorically, maybe as a culture, we don't care that much about that space. Maybe it's not that important to us. And I think it was meant as a hanging rhetorical question. So, worth discussing in terms of this magnificent city, really.
Can I tag on that? I think it really is an interesting question, and it gets at the issue of how much green can we manage. I think the National Park Service has had its hands full with trying to manage the acres and acres and acres of green and lawn and natural vegetation. I shouldn't say natural, it's designed. But they now are getting lots of support from the Trust for the National Mall. And I think it's not that there's not an interest in caring about those resources. I think that there really hasn't been a vehicle for funding it just because of the way funding works in America, and I don't know if it's different in other countries. I know Central Park and Prospect Park get huge infusions of private money. The Central Park Conservancy has an annual operating budget of, I don't know what, $40 million or something like that. There's no way that the city of New York could sustain all of that and raise that kind of money and put that kind of money. And I think the National Park Service nationally has a huge burden and a huge responsibility, and I think it's incredibly wonderful that the private sector is stepping up to help start that process going. And so what you were talking about with the National Mall looking like a dug-up place is the beginning of that desire to have a lawn that is like the great lawn in Central Park.
I mean, I guess as a historian, though, I'd weigh in that we can emphasize the way that protests have used public spaces and have done things with permits and all that. But there have been many protests, and there's a part of Occupy that just said, screw it. We don't have to behave the way people tell us to behave, or what the norms are. And they often are hugely controversial, as Occupy was, and all its variations were. But I mean, that's an element of protest that I think is essential to remember. I mean, that people don't, I think you said it, they don't always want to be in the place they want to be, or sometimes there is no public space. The space that they want to claim is inherently private, and they need to protest there anyway. Going back to my youth and protesting at nuclear power plants, they weren't public spaces. We were, occupying and I think, we were using parking lots, but I mean, so I think it's that uncertainty, but it's also that contingency that's really important to remember when we think about protest in relationship to public space, because you're never going to know how, or just open spaces, when they're going to use them in a different way. I mean, I'm totally with all of you on I've been, as someone who's really appreciates the mall as a vehicle for large demonstrations, I've been something of an ambivalent about the National Trust for the Mall. I mean, I'm okay, and I talk to the park police, and I know how hard those people work, and I know how much strain the city's under, or the government's under, working for a federal agency as well right now. But, it's I just worry that the next step will be, all the rights that First Amendment protests now have on the mall could start to go away. Because right now, First Amendment protests here in Washington have really high rights in comparison to some other places.
I have that concern. I had that concern a little bit. I happen to have been involved in this year's solar decathlon undertaking.
Yeah.
And I think everyone here recalls that there was a great debate about where the installation would be. It was traditionally, for the last 10 years, I guess, on the mall, and it was moved closer to the MLK Memorial, I guess, on something still called the mall, but when you look at the map, it's not quite the mall. It's kind of sort of the mall.
Playing fields almost.
And I was a little bit troubled by that, only because I thought the purpose of this government-funded program was to make sure that people in government witnessed this attempt to do something that was going to be energy conserving and design celebrating. I mean, I thought that was the whole idea. So to remove it and hide it on the basis that it would disturb the grounds of the mall, which of course now are being dug up. So you might as well just, put it on there and dug it out afterwards. I mean, who's in charge of the schedule? And then when I did get to the location where the Decathlon was installed, it was installed on some temporary walkway that was well, it was, I don't know if any of you visited it, but it's sort of cupped and they turned into walking ponds and mud. It was a very bad installation, and it really, it didn't help further the purposes that the client themselves had put forth. So I'm saying that because I think we all have ambivalence about this. Laurie Olin, in his response to the question, I started reading it, he said, people cannot sleep in parks. It's not a question, it's not a debate. Parks are not for people to inhabit. And and then he went on later on to say, I was a protester, I marched against the war, I know what that's all about. And you could see he himself, a designer of these locations, is ambivalent. So we're in the middle of a big debate. We're not up here with answers. We don't have answers. We're in the middle of a debate that's been brought about by people who are testing the right to do things.
Well, I'm glad you brought up the solar decathlon, because that might be a way to sort of reframe this a little bit. We keep talking about protests versus what we're thinking of as the normal leisure of picnicking and throwing frisbees, kids with balloons, the usual image of who's in our public parks. But the solar decathlon makes the point that I think all demonstrations are not protests. The solar decathlon is really a demonstration, right, in the literal sense. It demonstrates something. And there are a lot of those other activities that it sounds like the panel is a little bit concerned that there's a creeping erosion, or maybe even phrase it differently, an over-aestheticization of our parks and landscapes where the value of the perfect grass overrides the value of the use. Let Tom take this one, then we'll get
Let me say that, I've been working, our agency and many others, as the Park Service has actually been addressing this for probably 5 years of serious planning on trying to figure out, weigh these two fundamental issues about basically maintenance versus access. And do you want, and people have complained bitterly about the mud puddles and the horrible conditions of the mall. At the same time, I will tell you, everything I ever hear from the Park Service is that they always put the First Amendment rights and of access first. But it is this balance, and of course what we're seeing right now is the construction to actually redo the turf, the first 3 panels moving west from the Capitol area. Whether that lasts, I don't know. I think it does get to what is different about Washington. We talked about that, and it's probably, New York is probably the most wonderful example of a really commercial city. Washington, of course, has got this public purpose, and it really goes over the top in terms of the symbolic landscape that it creates as a frame. And I just want to touch on a couple of these things where it's got to be balanced and it has to function for a national purpose as well. So there's a range, there's the recreational activities, there's the angry protest, Occupy. And there's actually this huge sort of middle ground of whether it's the Solar Decathlon or the Folk Life Festival, but you also have these amazing national events, which it's public space physically, but it's actually public space culturally nationwide. It's actually where we want to see a million people for the inaugural, and we want to see whatever, Martin Luther King's speech or whatever it is. We want to we have this stage where it can take place. So Washington is probably, the needle is so far over on that, is even the amount of public space or green space that we have, as you pointed out in the chart, we're sort of in the middle. It gets to be pretty far flung, but that's that scale that has to function. I just want to say, when we talk about these public spaces, I just want to throw a couple of requisites. I'm finding, looking at it in D.C. at least, that having some symbolic connection to the purpose of the city is important, whether it's that you're in a radial avenue or it has some vista or connection to the monuments or something is one thing, and then it also has a physical and framing quality. I don't know. And finally, I'm also gathering from these other discussions that these places seem to work better when there's this sense of some kind of density. I just throw that out there. Does it work? Can you have public space in a cornfield?
I was wondering
really
whether,
good question.
I don't know who here might have heard Young Gale's presentation,
Yes.
but in his most recent book,
Brilliant work.
he has quite a nice discussion about how hard it is to create public space in places where the density is so low that there's no public activity.
Right.
So, and he shows diagrams and charts of how things have to be brought together to create a certain kind of density that's confrontation. So we have our old towns, our streetcar suburbs with porches, and people are together. By the time it's the car and you have the apron and the car moves the house back, and finally the house is so far away from the street that you may or may never see your neighbor. The kids may play, but you may not to see your neighbor. I wanted to go back to the other comment that you made about 2 or 3 people. I was looking for a quote, it'll pass. About 2 or 3 people responding to the question I raised exactly the question of the aestheticizing or usurping of public space, made real direct observations. Denise Hoffman-Brandt, an up-and-coming really player, thinker in this area, said the idea that all open spaces have to be populated by children's playgrounds or herb gardens or whatever it was, the idea that everything has to be used erodes the ability for it to be accidental, occasional, informal, and of great value for communication. There's a teacher up at the Rhode Island School of Design, Olga Koper, who wrote one of the first pieces I ever read about sustainability, and her most critical comment about sustainability was, sustainability requires that there be neutral ground or common ground at which people meet and discuss what's going on in their culture, their society, and their lives. Not programmed, but unprogrammed. So I think there is an issue with that. I mean, I think that is probably an issue in terms of what happens in the beautiful landscape of Washington. It must be part of the debate every time there's a new proposal for another monument that takes another, few acres of land to be, tightly programmed so that in the end we all know
You'll look neutral.
I was about to segue to take questions from the audience, but I want to make sure that this doesn't turn into a discussion about new memorial and monument proposals.
Sorry about that.
No, it's a Washington,
It's a Washington
it's a
thing.
constant conversation.
Listen, it's a Boston one, and it's a New York one.
And every city.
One thing I just want to tag on to what he said, and what is, in the future, if the purpose of public space is for people to come together and talk about what's important, what happens to public space as that discussion starts to exist in a virtual environment?
And there's a whole lot to talk about that.
I wanted to
Not
add
to
one
worry.
thing, too.
Yeah.
Not to worry, because I think we've seen we've seen the light on that. Tahrir Square is the result of digital communications. Nothing like that ever happened without virtual communication. Same thing with Occupy around the world. It has only served to support, encourage, and enable. It's quite wonderful in that way. Against the futurist thinking of 30 or 40 years ago that we would no longer go to work. We would have to go to work anymore.
Faye, why don't you make a
That would
comment,
be
then
nice.
I'm going to open it up for a couple of questions.
Yeah, I just wanted to go back to some Olmstedian principles, really, that have to do with democratization of open space and parkland. And the point exactly that he was always making was that you need those broad open spaces that are free and that are available for various activities. And in the kind of restoration work that I've been doing, it's a constant battle to not have the herb garden, particularly when there's a donor involved, not have the playground, not have the plaque, not have the memorial, and protect those spaces for broader democratic use. So anyway, that's sort of an old concept that I think is really valid. It's still fresh.
And still pertinent. Do we have some questions from the audience? I'm sure some people have some things to say. We'll take this one right here. Yes, please wait for the microphones because we're recording this.
You're all great, but there's no planner on the panel. And you just mentioned Olmsted, but the contradictions about how to use public spaces started with the basic parks movement, where you were just supposed to go there and be refreshed. And in the city, too, with the City Beautiful movement, it was about venerating government and socializing people. And parks planning, open space planning, allowing for contestation hasn't caught up. And certainly DC itself doesn't even have a parks master plan. DC, the city, but then typically a local government wouldn't make recommendations with regard to federal spaces. But the federal spaces are used by the people, and there needs to be guidance. And one more thing,
And did you have a
for the
question?
professor is Planning in the Public Domain by John Friedman. You got to read it, because it's about this issue, about how do you have a radical planning practice in the context of a bureaucratized society.
Okay, thank you. Anyone want to comment on that, or we've got a question up front here?
I'm wondering to what extent planning and money may actually make public space worse. In downtown Silver Spring, we had a public-private partnership to redevelop a large area, and the commercial got built, commercial restaurants, parking garage, a lot of bus service, close to a metro station. The public part lagged about 3 years behind, and a block was set aside for that. All they did was clean it up, put down AstroTurf, of all things. People thought they were crazy. But the AstroTurf turned out to be an extremely popular gathering spot. Nobody paid anything for planning of what they were going to do on it. People just showed up, no picnic tables, no nothing. People just came, and it was extremely popular. In fact, there were protests when they removed it so they could build the new civic building and the ice skating rink and the paved plaza. So to what extent should we have just leave the space and people will take care of it and come and use it, rather than spending a lot of money and plan?
Pretty provocative question. Faye, as the landscape architect up here, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I guess it's a good question for a landscape architect. I have to tell you that is I think, very valuable use of public space. There's a program that I know has happened in some cities called Park It, where people have been encouraged to take over a parking space and put down a little AstroTurf, and as soon as the city allows that to happen, people will put a blanket down, they'll put chairs down. I think that kind of ad hoc use of open space is wonderful. I guess for me, there has to be a balance. I think it's sad to have commercial development that is so far ahead of all the infrastructure and the heavy development that no attention is paid to the open space. But you're sort of getting to the issue that I raised with my first statement, that I think many designers tend to over-design, and I think you have to leave places for things to happen comfortably and naturally. And so if it happens and it's successful, by all means, I think there's a balance that has to be found in that. I think actually the designs that have just been awarded by the Trust for the National Mall, I think, are very interesting. If you look at the competition winners, all the way across the board for all of the specific sites that they were tasked with, the simplest, most elegant designs were the ones that won. The ones that had a lot of gizmos and gimmicks and openings in the ground and up and over and this and that, those were not the ones that were selected, as clever and as imaginative as they were. So I think this idea of simplicity and restraint is very important, whether it becomes planned or whether it's an ad hoc community-supported effort. I really think it's important.
I think just to tag on to that, one or two quick comments. I think it depends on who the developer is. In New York, I can think of two developers. Dan Brodsky, he says he does a park, and housing around it, the park gets done first, and the housing comes, and
Yes.
people move in, the park is ready for their
Exactly.
kids, it's fabulous. Donald Trump does the Riverside South, the buildings are almost finished, the park is half done, it's lagging behind. So, and who's the watchdog? The other thing is something about all of that informal activity. There are two books, one called The Beach Beneath the Streets, and the other Insurgent Space, Jeffrey Howe out in California, and Gregory Smith-Simon in New York, and they talk about spaces that people find to do things, whether they've been prepared or not prepared, where much of the really wonderful activities happen. And that's a whole other category of behavior that I think New York City with the mayor's commissioner, has managed to regularize. I think that's what we're finding is public insurgency. It's quite exciting.
Well, I think the whole movement of taking over the streets for park space, where it just became bring your lawn chair,
Yeah.
and then it became let's have some pots and some benches, and then, I mean, it's really been successful. And I'm a New Yorker also originally, so I love to see it.
That's great. That's great.
Okay, we've got one question there, and
Yes,
then we'll have
I'd
one
like
more.
to just echo what Faye has said about keeping it simple and allowing spontaneity and things to happen. A lot of designers want to design, and sometimes the more undesigned, to use that term, but design but with simplicity is very effective. And to follow up on the other person's comment about the open space in Silver Spring, the AstroTurf, it might be interesting for everyone to know that the Planning Board, Planning Commission, making the decision that night on whether to leave the AstroTurf or follow through with the plans to build a civic space in the ice skating rink and a typical plaza, was an open public session, and it really came down to who came to that public session to speak up for which design, which way to go forward. So I just want to speak towards everyone should be involved and engaged in these decisions, because it often comes down to who shows up.
That's a very good point, and that's a whole nother conversation. We'll take, I think, one more question, try to get some geographic separation. There we go.
I think probably one problem with public spaces in the United States is the educational process which we use for students at all levels, primary, secondary, and college, frequently is set up architecturally in such a way so that students cannot have large meetings. They're not really exposed to public spaces or in the educational environment when they are going to school. Okay? As a consequence, I think, as adults, we don't pay as much attention to the possibility of public spaces because of our upbringing.
So is there an acculturation issue? I mean, we've talked lovingly about Italian public space and the Euro envy of people seeming to know how to use public space. Is there an acculturation problem in the U.S.? And maybe a quick answer to that, and if there is a quick answer to that.
I mean, as a historian, I think that the life of the streets, for lots of different reasons in the 19th century and through the 50s, sort of before the car really stole so much life from a lot of us, a lot of living. My great-grandfather was a huge transformed traffic proponent, so I know something of this world. I think that really helped inspire both a love for parks and also often was a parallel for how marches and different styles of demonstrations were modeled, because they had, they'd seen them. I mean, as much as a protest march was very like a parade, a patriotic parade in the early years. I mean, the differences one was, celebrating the state as it was, and the other was asking for a state change. But, so, I mean, I'm having a little trouble with the school model. I mean, I went to a school where they decided to take out all the walls in a 70s moment. So we had 70 kids in 4th grade running around, and we sure knew about chaos, and maybe that's why I was a little politically active. Subsequently, they put the walls back in, undoubtedly for the sanity of the teachers, because it really was kind of,
Listen, I think your point is so well taken. I think it's so important. I think so much of this starts at that level. And to quantify that, not at the beginning levels, but the recognition of that has become manifest in the work of the City University's physical plant system. The City University, I think next to the GSA, is the largest single builder in the country at 500,000 students. And they have gone in their recent round of buildings from a net to gross ratio internally of 70 to 30, 70% rooms, 30% circulation. They've gone to 50-50. They've increased the public space in the school with the idea that there wasn't enough space for people to meet, have informal gatherings, and I went through a couple of the buildings that have large areas of seating, and it's very much that point. I think it's a very good point. I think much of this is how we are conditioned.
Okay, we are almost officially out of time. We have one more question, and then I want to give concluding comments.
I just wanted to say that I find a contradiction in your celebration of the protest movements as uses for these spaces. It strikes me that the people who like to eat lunch in McPherson Square must have been terribly inconvenienced by the consistent use of that space by the Occupy D.C. people. And it also almost sounds as if you were saying, well, we ought to design public spaces to facilitate protest. Now, I'm sure that the Pope and others who mandated public spaces back in the 15th and 16th century did not intend them to be used for protest. And I'd love to hear your comments on the contradiction in these two kinds of uses.
I'd be happy to discuss that. I do recall reading something about McPherson Square that suggested that there wasn't as much conflict as one would assume. And I thought that was very, very interesting. I know that in the area around Zuccotti Park, there was enormous debate about the disturbance. It's kind of interesting because I think probably the protesters thought they were in a corporate district, and it turns out that there are many more people resident in Lower Manhattan than anybody really realizes, 60 or 70,000 people. So I think even in a couple of the quotations I read, I think that's a real issue. That's one of the things I was trying to get at in the Herman Square example in Houston, where one group, feeling as though they had usurped space possibly from another, hardly matters who the other group is, agreed to recuse themselves and give over the space so that others could share it. So I think that is always going to be a debate. It really will. But I think at the current moment, I guess, not from a professional, but from a personal point of view, if there were 3 weeks of disturbance in the 50 years that park has been there, to have a voice heard that is often unheard at a time like this, maybe a little inconvenience has to be sustained. I don't know. I mean, I really think that's a personal opinion.
Well, I think you're pointing out, emphasizing one of the points you made earlier, that there's not going to be a definitive answer to these questions. This is constant negotiation of public space and conversation and public participation. And I think that in the spirit of the Atherton lecture, that's a sort of wonderful conclusion. I did want to give a last word, actually, to Don Hawkins, who's here. Again, in the spirit of the Atherton lecture, I think Don had a few comments from Atherton family. I think we lost our microphone.
I'm glad you can hear me, because what I want to do is thank this group for having done what's happened at each of the Atherton lectures. We haven't gotten nearly as many answers as questions, but we've gotten a tremendous amount of information, and with which we can go on thinking about these questions, and this is definitely one we'll be thinking about for some time. The family has asked me to thank the donors, especially who made this possible to keep running this long. We weren't sure we'd get very far time-wise or event-wise, but it has been I think a great run, and in honor of Charles Atherton, it could hardly have been better. It's really been terrific. The Building Museum has been a wonderful venue for it, and I think that we can only be pleased that there was some good that came from an untimely death that, excuse me, none of us would have asked to trade off. But it has been a great way of continuing his memory and giving us more to think about in the city that he loved. And I'm sure one of the things that he would like to have heard would have been the number of times people said, "This is a beautiful city." Thank you very much.
Thank you, Don. And I want to thank our panelists one more time, our speaker, Lance. So one more round of applause, and thank you all for coming.